The last confirmed sighting of the Calder family came from a gas receipt printed at 6:42 a.m. on a fog-heavy October morning in 1994. The receipt was found years later in a storage box, its edges yellowed and curling, the ink almost gone. But at the time, it meant nothing. It was just another timestamp in a weekend meant to be ordinary, a fall road trip planned to mark the end of a long year. The Calders weren't running from anything. They weren't hiding. They had told neighbors exactly where they were going. A short drive north. A scenic route. 2 nights away before winter settled in. That was the plan. The family of 4 left their rental home outside Clearwater Junction, a quiet town near the Idaho-Wyoming border, just after sunrise. The father, a man in his early 40s, drove. His wife sat beside him, thermos in hand, flipping through a folded map even though the route was familiar. In the back seat were their children. A 19-year-old son, recently graduated and home from his first year away. And their 8-year-old daughter, excited for fall leaves and roadside photos. They packed light. A cooler. A camera. Jackets layered for cold mornings. Their destination was vague by design. Lakes, overlooks, small towns they could stop in if something caught their eye. It was the kind of trip families took before cell phones tracked every mile. And then, without warning, the Calders vanished. By Sunday night, no one was worried yet. They were supposed to return late. The son had talked about staying an extra day if the weather held. But by Monday morning, when the house was still dark and the answering machine still empty, concern crept in. By Tuesday, it turned into panic. Their vehicle, a dark green midsize SUV, was found abandoned off Old Timberline Road, a narrow stretch of pavement that cut through wetlands and low forest near Ashford Lake. The discovery raised immediate questions. The SUV was parked cleanly on the shoulder, not crashed. The keys were missing. The doors were unlocked. Inside, everything felt wrong. A half-empty travel mug still sat in the cup holder. A disposable camera rested on the dashboard, unused. On the back seat floor lay a paperback novel with a bookmark halfway through. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood. No broken glass. Just absence. Search teams were deployed within hours. Volunteers from surrounding counties flooded the area. Dogs were brought in. Boats combed the lake's edges. Divers scanned the murky water near the reeds. Nothing. Not a shoe. Not a scrap of fabric. Not a footprint leading away from the road. The terrain offered no easy answers. Ashford Lake wasn't deep, but its shoreline twisted into marshland thick with cattails and mud. If someone had entered the water, something should have surfaced. But nothing did. Days turned into weeks. The case gained brief regional attention, then quietly slipped into the growing archive of unsolved disappearances. Theories bloomed and died quickly. Accident. No evidence. A voluntary disappearance. Their bank accounts were untouched. A abduction. No witnesses. No ransom. The son's college friends were questioned. The father's co-workers were interviewed. The mother's past was examined inch by inch. Nothing stuck. By winter, the lake froze over. By spring, the trail had gone cold. And by the following year, the Calders were spoken of in the past tense. The investigation officially stalled in 1996. But the land didn't forget. 20 years passed. The road near Ashford Lake was widened to accommodate increased traffic from nearby developments. A new drainage system was planned along the lake's eastern bank, where erosion had slowly eaten away at the soil. In late September of 2014, a maintenance worker noticed something unusual while clearing brush near the waterline. At first, he thought it was trash. A piece of fabric tangled in reeds. Then he saw another. And another. Folded. Placed deliberately. Law enforcement was called. By the time detectives arrived, the sun was already dipping low, throwing long shadows across the lake. What they found laid out on the ground stopped the worksite cold. 4 articles of clothing. A man's jacket. A woman's coat. A young woman's sweater. And a larger hoodie, consistent with a teenage boy. They were worn. Mud-stained. But unmistakably preserved. What made the discovery chilling wasn't just what they found. It was how. The clothes were arranged in a neat row, parallel to the water's edge. Each piece placed flat, pockets empty, sleeves smoothed out, as if someone had taken time. Care. Evidence markers were placed beside them. Photos were taken. And within an hour, detectives began pulling old case files from storage. The Calder family was back. But the lake still wasn't giving up its secrets. As forensic teams worked under floodlights, one officer noticed something else. Faint impressions in the soil leading away from the clothing, not toward the water, but back into the tree line. And deeper still, something unnatural. Something that didn't belong to erosion, animals, or time. What they uncovered next would reopen a case long buried, and suggest the Calders hadn't simply vanished. They had been placed. And someone, somewhere, had waited 20 years for them to be found. By dawn, the stretch of shoreline near Ashford Lake had transformed into a controlled crime scene. Yellow tape cut through the mist. Portable lights hummed. The water lay still, reflecting a pale sky that looked almost indifferent to the activity unfolding beside it. For the officers and investigators gathered there, the discovery of the clothing wasn't just a lead, it was a rupture in time. Because the clothes were unmistakable. The sizes matched. The styles aligned with the mid-1990s. And stitched into the collar of the daughter's sweater, barely legible after years of exposure, was a faded handwritten name, her initials, written in marker the way parents did before school trips. That single detail collapsed any lingering doubt. The Calder family hadn't disappeared without a trace. They had been returned. The impressions in the soil, first noticed the night before, were examined more closely as daylight revealed their shape. They weren't footprints in the usual sense, no clear tread, no heel pattern, but rather compressed paths where weight had repeatedly pressed the ground flat. Dragging marks. Not recent, but not ancient either. They led away from the lake and into a dense strip of trees locals referred to as the Old Cut, a patch of forest left untouched since logging operations ended decades earlier. The ground there was uneven, tangled with roots and fallen branches, the kind of place search teams in the 90s had avoided because it offered little visibility and no clear trails. Now, 2 decades later, it demanded attention. As teams moved in, they found something else. Small metal survey stakes, half buried and rusted, placed at irregular intervals. They weren't modern. Their design matched equipment used by road and land crews in the 1940s. Leftover markers from another era. The discovery prompted a quiet but urgent shift in the investigation. Records were pulled. Old land use maps were reviewed. And slowly, an overlooked detail surfaced. During World War II, the area surrounding Ashford Lake had been temporarily repurposed. Not as a base or camp, but as a storage and transit zone used to hold equipment and supplies while rail lines were redirected. Dozens of workers passed through the region during those years, some staying briefly, others reassigned and never formally documented again. The Calders were not the only people who had ever vanished near that land. They were just the ones people remembered. Following the stakes, investigators reached a low rise hidden behind a curtain of brush. The ground there dipped unnaturally, forming a shallow depression that didn't match the surrounding terrain. Soil tests were ordered. Ground-penetrating scans followed. And then the machines lit up. 4 anomalies appeared beneath the surface, aligned, evenly spaced, and contained within what looked like a rectangular boundary. Not graves in the traditional sense. Not scattered remains. A structure. Excavation began carefully. Within hours, the edge of concrete was exposed. It was old, weathered, and deliberately concealed beneath layers of soil and forest debris. The entrance, a narrow slab sealed with mortar, had been hidden under roots and fallen leaves for years. When it was finally breached, the smell that escaped was not what anyone expected. There was no decay, no rot. Inside was a chamber. Clean. Dry. Ordered. The remains of 4 individuals lay within, positioned side by side. Not bound. Not restrained. Their clothing, different from what had been found at the lake, was intact, layered for warmth. Time had preserved them in a way that felt almost intentional. Forensic teams worked in silence, documenting everything. The spacing. The placement. The absence of defensive injuries on 3 of the 4. The father, however, told a different story. His injuries suggested blunt force trauma, severe, but not immediately fatal. Evidence indicated he had lived for days after being hurt. The others showed no such wounds. Air quality tests inside the chamber revealed trace indicators consistent with oxygen depletion over time. Whatever had happened down there hadn't been sudden. It had been prolonged. As investigators processed the site, another detail emerged, scratched faintly into the inner wall near where the daughter had been placed. The message was uneven, letters overlapping, as if written in low light by someone whose hand had grown tired. Please forgive me. I am keeping them safe. The words sent a chill through the room. This wasn't the message of a stranger acting out of rage. It was the message of someone who believed, at least at some point, that what they were doing was necessary. Nearby, tucked beneath the woman's arm, was a plastic bag. Inside it were photographs. Family photos. Taken months, maybe years, before the trip. Birthday candles. A graduation cap. A lakeside picnic that was not Ashford. Why they had been brought here remained unclear. But someone had wanted them to be remembered. As the investigation widened, attention turned to the land itself. Ownership records revealed that the parcel had changed hands multiple times, often through shell transfers and short-term leases. But one name appeared repeatedly across decades, sometimes as a buyer, sometimes as a silent partner. A man who had worked construction, surveying, temporary infrastructure projects. A man whose employment records traced back, not just to the 1990s, but to projects connected to wartime logistics in the 1940s. He had died 5 years before the discovery. Quietly. Alone. Neighbors described him as withdrawn. Haunted. A man who avoided lakes and refused to drive certain roads. In the years following the Calder's disappearance, he had reportedly been seen hauling heavy materials late at night, working without permits, pouring concrete on land he technically didn't own. At the time, no one questioned it. Now, every detail mattered. But the most unsettling piece of evidence came last. Among the daughter's personal effects was a folded note, written in cramped handwriting across multiple scraps of paper, as if space and time had been limited. It spoke of protection, of being hidden from someone else, of an uncle who was dangerous, and another who promised safety. It mentioned a door that was sealed, so they wouldn't find us. And near the end, the words trailed off into something harder to read. It's getting harder to breathe. But he said this is the only way. The note suggested a motive. But it also raised a terrifying question. If the man who built the chamber believed he was saving them, who was he hiding them from? And why, after all these years, had the clothing been placed by the lake? Neatly, deliberately, as if someone wanted the world to look again. Because, as detectives would soon realize, the person responsible for what happened to the Calders may not have been acting alone. The deeper investigators dug into the Calder case, the less it resembled a single act of violence, and the more it looked like the final chapter of something much older. The note found with the daughter's remains was analyzed line by line. Linguists studied the handwriting. Psychologists examined the phrasing. One detail stood out immediately. The tone shifted halfway through. Early lines were calm, almost reassuring. Later ones were rushed, cramped, and filled with repetition. Fear had entered the room. The uncle referenced in the note was never named, but records revealed something troubling. The man who had owned the land near Ashford Lake had a brother, estranged, transient, and known to law enforcement in multiple counties during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Charges had followed him for attempted abduction and unlawful confinement, but convictions never stuck. He had disappeared from official records in the mid-1990s. Not dead, just gone. When detectives revisited the years following the Calders' disappearance, patterns began to emerge. The landowner's behavior had shifted dramatically after October 1994. He withdrew from social life, abandoned long-term projects, and sold off equipment at a loss. He stopped using certain roads entirely, especially the one near Ashford Lake. Former co-workers recalled seeing him cry once while loading bags of cement into his truck late at night. At the time, they assumed it was stress. Now, the memory carried weight. But motive alone wasn't enough. Investigators needed to know how the family had been lured, or forced, into the chamber. The answer came from an overlooked witness statement buried in the original file. A park ranger had reported seeing a green SUV pulled over near the old cut on the morning the Calders vanished. Beside it stood two men. One appeared calm, speaking with the father. The other kept his distance, pacing. At the time, the sighting was dismissed. Two men talking on a roadside meant nothing. 20 years later, it meant everything. The theory that formed was chilling. The landowner, familiar with the area and aware of his brother's history, believed the Calders were in danger, perhaps targeted, perhaps followed. Whether that threat was real or imagined remains unknown. But evidence suggests he convinced the family to come with him, promising safety. The chamber had been built before the trip. Concrete curing timelines proved it. This wasn't improvisation. It was preparation. The father's injuries suggested resistance, possibly when he realized the protection had become imprisonment. The others may have trusted the man who spoke softly, who referenced shared history, who insisted this was temporary. And when something went wrong, when air thinned, panic set in, and escape became impossible, the landowner sealed the chamber completely. Not to kill, but because he believed opening it would doom them. In the years that followed, he carried the weight of that choice alone. Until he couldn't anymore. The placement of the clothing by the lake appeared to be an act of confession. Not done in haste, but with care. The garments had been cleaned, folded, and returned to the last place the family was seen alive. A message without words. An invitation to look again. Authorities concluded that the landowner had likely arranged the display shortly before his death, driven by guilt and a desire to be understood, if not forgiven. But one detail refused to settle. The brother. Despite extensive searches, no death record was ever found. No remains. No verified sightings after the mid-1990s. If the danger he posed had been real, he had never been held accountable. which meant the fear that sealed the chamber might not have been imaginary after all. Today, the Calder case remains officially closed, but unanswered. The chamber has been sealed once more, the land reclaimed by the forest. The lake reflects the sky as it always has, quiet and unchanged. And somewhere, perhaps not far at all, the question still lingers. Did the man who built the chamber save the Calders from something worse? Or did his fear become the very thing that destroyed them? Because one truth remains certain. Whatever happened on that fall road trip in 1994 was not an accident. It was a decision. And the cost of that decision waited 20 years to surface. What do you think really happened to the Calder family? Was it a desperate act of protection gone wrong, or something far darker? Drop your theory in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe and share this video with someone who loves true crime.